Imagine a world where
I pledge
peace
my
is
life and
fragile,
loyalty to you,
where
my
every
lord,
horizon
until my
hides
last
the
breath.
shadow of battle, where entire villages pray that the next sunrise will not bring smoke and blood. In this world, a new kind of man begins to rise. Not a farmer, not a noble, but something forged between. A warrior bound by loyalty, honor, and steel. This is the beginning of a class that would shape the destiny of Japan for centuries. This is the dawn of the samurai. Before the samurai, Japan was not one great nation, but a patchwork of provinces. The emperor sat far away in the capital of Heian-kyo, a place of silk robes, poetry, and music, where nobles wrote love notes on scented paper and spoke in riddles. It was a world of refinement and delicate games. But outside the walls of the capital, the story was very different. Beyond the city lay endless rice fields, mountain valleys, and small villages where farmers bent their backs to the earth from sunrise to dusk. These farmers lived simple lives, but they lived in fear. Bandits raided roads, rival clans seized fields, and distant wars often spilled over into their quiet lands. The noble families of the capital soon realized their poems and music could not protect their rice harvests, so they turned to something more practical. They began to hire men who could fight. At first, these men were simple guards, armed retainers who lived on the estates of their lords. But step by step, they became something new. They were no longer just servants. They were becoming professionals, warriors who lived for the clash of steel and the loyalty they gave to those who paid them. These early warriors rode on horseback, their armor made from plates of leather bound together with cords. Their main weapon was not the sword, but the bow. They became masters of mounted archery. Imagine the scene: a rider galloping across a wide green field, hair streaming behind him, the creak of the bowstring drawn tight, and then the sharp whistle of an arrow slicing through the air. This was the terror of the battlefield in those first centuries: fast-moving, precise, unstoppable. These warriors began to win not only battles, but reputations. In time, certain clans grew famous for their fighters. The Taira and the Minamoto were among the strongest. Their men lived in constant training, not only in how to ride and shoot, but how to endure. They were raised to believe that death on the battlefield was not a loss, but an honor. It was better to fall with a weapon in hand than to live with shame. Slowly, something was forming, a way of life that was more than survival. It was the seed of what would one day be called Bushido, the way of the warrior. Life for these men was hard. They were not the polished courtiers of the capital. Their homes were wooden fortresses with tall gates and narrow watchtowers. Their food was plain, rice and fish, but their pride was sharp as their blades. Every boy born into a warrior family was taught from childhood to ride, to shoot, to fight, and to respect the chain of command. Loyalty to clan and lord was everything. Without it, a warrior was nothing. As conflict spread across Japan, these fighters became essential. Nobles who once ruled from gardens of plum blossoms now found themselves relying on rough men in armor. These men began to hold power of their own. After all, what is a landowner without soldiers to defend his land? Soon the warriors were not only defending,
they were taking. They seized estates, collected taxes, and built networks of loyalty among themselves. The balance of Japan was shifting. By the late Heian period, the emperor's court was losing real control. The poetry and music in the capital continued, but outside, the warrior clans were becoming the true power. Battles broke out between them. Rivers turned red, smoke rose above burning villages, and the clash of steel became the heartbeat of the land. This was no longer the world of poets. This was the world of fighters. Imagine standing on a battlefield in the 12th century, the ground wet with morning dew, the air heavy with the smell of sweat and horses. Two lines of warriors face each other across the plain. Banners flap in the wind, painted with family crests. One side cries out its name, the other answers. Then the charge begins. Arrows fly in clouds, horses scream, men collide in a storm of steel. This is the reality of the dawn of the warrior class, brutal and relentless, yet bound by honor. For even in these bloody moments there were rules. Warriors called out their names before attacking so that deeds could be remembered. Glory was not faceless, it was personal. The rise of the warrior class was not only about war, it was about identity. These men saw themselves as different from farmers, priests, or courtiers. They were a breed apart, and they began to carry symbols of this pride. Their swords became more refined, curved blades that shone in the sun, crafted with skill that seemed almost divine. To hold such a weapon was to hold one's soul. Even if the bow remained their main tool in war, the sword became their spirit. This new class also tied itself to faith. The warriors looked to Buddhism, especially Zen, which taught them calm in the face of chaos. Imagine a man seated before battle, eyes closed, breathing slow, his mind clear as still water. When he rose, he carried that calm into the storm of war. The blending of violence and serenity became a mark of the samurai spirit. Step by step, the warriors grew in number and in power. They became lords in their own right, and their loyalty shifted from the distant emperor to their clan leaders. Entire families were now defined not by poetry or trade, but by arms. Sons followed fathers into the saddle. Daughters were taught to defend their homes with naginata spears. The entire society of Japan was tilting toward the warriors. By the 12th century, the tension between the great clans exploded. The Taira and the Minamoto fought a bitter struggle known as the Genpei War. It was a conflict of epic scale, filled with betrayals, heroic duels, and battles on sea and land. When it ended, the Minamoto emerged victorious, and Japan entered a new age, the age of the shogun. But that is the story of the next chapter. For now, what matters is this. In the quiet fields where farmers once feared bandits, in the halls where nobles once whispered poems, something new had been born. A class of warriors who would dominate Japan for centuries. Men who lived by steel, loyalty, and death. Their dawn had broken, and the sun of the samurai was rising. And so,
picture this. The battlefield is silent for a heartbeat. Then suddenly the ground shakes with the thunder of hooves. Arrows streak across the sky like deadly rain. The warriors riding these horses are not ordinary men. They are lightning in human form, masters of bow and speed, every shot fired with calm precision. They
are the mounted archers of Japan, feared and unstoppable. Yet time will shape them into something even greater, men whose souls would be bound not to arrows but to blades, the masters of the sword. This is the story of transformation, the moment when the samurai shifted from mounted hunters to legendary swordsmen. In the earliest days, the bow was king, long and asymmetrical, taller than a man. Made of wood and bamboo, the Japanese bow was a strange and powerful weapon. Warriors called it the yumi, and it could pierce armor from 100 yards away. Imagine the sound, the deep creak of the bowstring, the sudden snap, and then the whistle of the arrow slicing the air before it thudded into flesh or wood. On horseback, the yumi became even deadlier. A rider would stand tall in his stirrups, twisting his body to release shot after shot. It was like watching poetry in motion, and for centuries this was the image of the samurai, not with a sword, but with a bow. Mounted archery was not just about war, it was a ritual. It became an art form called yabusame. Imagine a lone rider charging down a narrow track, 3 wooden targets set up along the way. As the horse gallops, the rider must draw, aim, and fire, each arrow released without hesitation. The crowd gasps as the arrows shatter the targets. The smell of dust rises, the sound of hooves echoes. It is not only a contest of skill, but of spirit. The warrior must be calm as still water, focused as the moon. In this ritual, the bow was more than a weapon. It was a bridge between man, nature, and the gods. But as wars grew larger, the battlefield changed. Armor became stronger, armies became bigger. Battles were no longer just duels between elite archers on horseback. They became storms of men colliding, shield against shield, spear against spear. In this chaos, the bow lost some of its power, for when enemies closed in, when arrows had been spent, when the dust turned to mud beneath trampling feet, what mattered most was the weapon held in one's hands. And that weapon was the sword. The sword was unlike any tool the world had seen, curved, sharp, balanced like an extension of the body, forged with a craft so secret and so sacred that even today it feels almost mythical. Imagine the glow of the forge, sparks flying as the smith hammers steel, folding it again and again, each strike echoing like a drumbeat, each layer strengthening the blade, until at last the sword gleamed like liquid moonlight. To hold it was to hold something alive. It was said a sword carried the spirit of its maker, the soul of its wielder, the fate of battles themselves. Slowly, the identity of the samurai began to shift. He was no longer just an archer on horseback. He became a swordsman. His katana was not only a weapon, it was his soul. In times of peace, it hung at his side. In times of war, it cut through enemies with unstoppable grace. The sword demanded closeness. It was not distant like the bow. It was personal. It meant looking your opponent in the eyes, feeling the clash of steel against steel, hearing the ring echo in your ears, smelling the sweat and blood. The sword was intimacy and death combined. Training changed with this shift. Young warriors still learned to ride and shoot, but now they also drilled endlessly in the art of the blade. In small courtyards under the morning sun, they practiced cuts and strikes, their movements slow, precise, repeated until their muscles remembered what their minds could forget. The hiss of steel through the air, the sharp crack as wooden practice swords struck. Hours passed until hands bled, sweat poured, and legs shook. Only then was the lesson complete. Mastery was not a gift, it was built through pain. Swords also carried meaning beyond war. They became symbols of class and honor. A samurai without his sword was no samurai. The weapon was both badge and burden, and with it came responsibility. Stories spread of warriors who treated their swords as sacred treasures, never drawing them without purpose, never staining them without cause. Legends whispered of blades that cut through armor like silk, or that chose their masters by fate. Whether true or not, these stories wrapped the sword in mystery, and mystery gave it power. The transformation from bow to sword was not sudden. It was slow, like dawn breaking. Archery remained a core of samurai tradition, but the sword began to dominate memory and imagination. Why? Because battles are remembered not by arrows fired from a distance, but by the duels fought face to face, the moments when two men clashed in the mud, their blades sparking as they struck again and again. It was these moments that poets and storytellers captured, and soon the samurai became forever tied to the sword. We can see this change in the wars of the Kamakura and Muromachi periods. Battles were no longer simple charges of mounted archers. They became brutal melees where swords, spears, and naginata ruled. Imagine a field thick with smoke, banners waving in the wind, men shouting, the clash of metal constant. A samurai rides in, loosing arrows until his quiver is empty. Then he leaps from his horse, draws his sword, and dives into the fray. His blade gleams with every strike. This is the image that endured. This is the image that became legend. Yet the sword was more than practical. It shaped philosophy. Zen Buddhism gave warriors the calm to face death, but the sword gave them the clarity of action. To cut cleanly was to live cleanly. To hesitate was to fall. The edge of the blade was the edge of life itself. Every duel became a lesson in mortality, every stripe a meditation. The samurai learned to see the sword as a teacher, one that never lied, one that punished weakness instantly. Over time, the sword became so central that entire schools were built around its mastery. Teachers passed down styles like precious heirlooms. Scrolls recorded stances, cuts, and secrets. Students bowed before training, swore oaths of loyalty, and practiced until their breath came ragged. Generations lived and died by these teachings. Some schools still exist today, echoing the same movements traced under the morning sun hundreds of years ago. But perhaps the most powerful reason the sword replaced the bow in memory is that the sword made the samurai human. It forced him to step close, to face another soul directly. No distance, no shadow, only the truth of steel between them. This closeness made their battles unforgettable. It burned them into the story of Japan and into the imagination of the world. So, when we think of the samurai now, when we see them in films, paintings, or legends, it is not the bow that comes to mind. It is the sword. The curved katana gleaming like a crescent moon, held in hands steady with centuries of tradition. It is the weapon that transformed them, that carried their honor, that gave them identity.
Picture the land of Japan in the 12th century, mountains wrapped in mist, rivers cutting through fields of rice, villages clinging to valleys like fragile lanterns in the dark. Now picture fire, banners rising above the smoke, riders thundering across the earth, swords drawn, arrows flying. This is not the world of poets anymore. This is the world of warriors, and at the heart of it stands a new kind of power, men who are not simply fighters, but rulers, men who command armies, collect taxes, and bend the fate of provinces. These are the samurai lords, and their rise would forever change Japan. In the beginning, samurai were only retainers, hired blades serving court nobles. They fought to protect estates and drive away bandits. They lived by the sword, but were bound to someone else's will. Yet, as battles grew larger and the countryside more unstable, these warriors discovered something. They had power not just on the battlefield, but off it. A warrior with men at his back, horses in his stables, and rice to feed them could become more than a servant. He could become a master. The fall of the old aristocracy gave them their chance. In Heian-kyo, the nobles still wrote poetry and played courtly games, but their wealth and authority crumbled. They could not protect their distant lands. They could not raise armies of their own. So step by step, the samurai they once hired took control. They seized estates, married into noble families, and slowly turned from guards into landlords. Imagine walking into one of their strongholds. Wooden palisades standing tall against the horizon, watchtowers looking out over rivers and valleys. Inside, you would hear the clang of swords as young men trained, the smell of sweat and dust filling the air. Banners painted with family crests snapping in the wind. The samurai lord ruled from a raised hall, his retainers kneeling before him, pledging loyalty, every word heavy with respect and fear. The greatest of these rising families were the Taira and the Minamoto. Their names carried weight like thunder. They were not only warriors but political players, gaining influence at court while commanding vast armies in the provinces. The countryside became their chessboard, and the pieces were thousands of men in armor. The Taira clan seized control first. Their leader, Taira no Kiyomori, rose from the battlefield to the heights of government. He placed his daughters into the imperial family, he gained titles, and for a time the Taira seemed unstoppable. Their banners stretched from coast to coast, their fleets ruled the seas. But power is a flame that attracts enemies, and the Minamoto clan was waiting. The Genpei War erupted in 1180, a conflict that would decide the future of Japan. Picture the battlefields, fog rolling over rivers, arrows blotting the sky, samurai charging with cries of loyalty to their clan. It was not only a war of armies, but of legends, stories of duels on horseback, of warriors announcing their names before striking, of loyalty and betrayal echoing through valleys. The war lasted 5 years, and by the end, the Taira were broken, their fleets sunk in the sea, their warriors scattered. From the ashes rose the Minamoto. Their leader, Minamoto no Yoritomo, built something no samurai had done before. He established a military government, the shogunate, from his base in Kamakura, far from the emperor's capital. For the first time in history, Japan was ruled not by court nobles, but by warriors. The samurai lords had taken the throne of power. Life under these new lords was strict and demanding. Loyalty was the glue that held the system together. Vassals swore fealty to their lord. In return, the lord gave them land, rice, and protection, but betrayal was punished by death. Honor became more than a word, it was survival. To fail your lord was to lose everything, family, name, even life. But there was pride too. Imagine a samurai summoned by his lord bowing low as he received a sword, a horse, or a banner to carry into war. That gift was not just material, it was a sign of belonging, of being part of something greater. The lord's power was measured not only by land, but by the loyalty of men willing to die for him. These lords were more than generals. They were judges and governors. They collected taxes, kept order, and built networks of fortresses across the land. Peasants bowed when they passed. Merchants traded under their protection. Priests blessed their banners. The samurai lord had become the beating heart of Japan's provinces. And yet this rise was not without cost. Constant wars tore the land. Villages burned, families starved. And for the farmers who tilled the rice, the samurai lord was both protector and oppressor. They lived under the shadow of his fortress, knowing their harvest might feed his armies before it fed their children. Still, his power was absolute, his authority unquestioned. In the Kamakura period, the system deepened. The shogun sat at the top, but beneath him stretched a web of lords and vassals, each bound by loyalty and obligation. It was a pyramid of steel and rice, held together by fear, honor, and the ever-present threat of war. But yet within this system was beauty too. Samurai lords became patrons of temples and shrines. They supported the spread of Zen gardens, the building of castles, the refinement of the tea ceremony. War and culture walked hand in hand, the sword and the brush shaping Japan together. Imagine standing in the courtyard of a samurai lord's castle, the stones cold under your feet, the air filled with the smell of pine smoke. Warriors kneel in rows, their armor shining, their helmets decorated with horns and crests. At the top sits the Lord, his face stern, his words few, but his presence immense. This was not only a man, this was a symbol, a living pillar of authority. The rise of these lords reshaped Japan forever. From simple fighters, they became rulers. From hired retainers, they became kings in all but name. They commanded armies, ruled provinces, and lived with the constant knowledge that power was never permanent, that rivals always waited, swords sharpened in the dark. And this is where the story turns. For while the samurai lords rose to greatness, their world was never secure. Challenges loomed on the horizon, enemies from beyond the seas, storms that would test their strength, and within, the seeds of rivalries that would one day tear them apart.
Imagine standing on a silent battlefield just before dawn, the air cold, the ground still wet with dew, broken helmets and shattered arrows scattered across the earth. In the distance, the crows are already gathering, yet amid this silence, a single man kneels, his head bowed, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. He is not afraid, he's not broken, because he has something greater than life itself. He has honor. This is the invisible armor of the samurai, stronger than steel, brighter than flame. It is called Bushido, the way of the warrior, and it became the code that defined not only how the samurai fought, but how they lived, how they died, and how they are remembered. Bushido was not written down in a single book. It was not one law, but many ideas woven together across centuries. Imagine it as a path through the forest, a road walked by thousands of feet, every step shaping it until it became clear. This path taught that a samurai's duty was not to himself, but to something larger, to his lord, to his family, to the ancestors watching from beyond. It said that courage, honesty, loyalty, and respect were not choices, they were obligations. To fail in them was to lose everything. At the heart of Bushido was loyalty, a loyalty so deep it could not be broken. A samurai was bound to his lord with a tie stronger than blood. He would fight for him, bleed for him, and if necessary, die for him. Imagine the moment, a lord standing in his hall, his men kneeling before him, heads bowed, their voices swearing to serve, the smell of incense burning, the heavy silence filled with the weight of that promise. This was not just politics, it was sacred. But loyalty was only one part. There was also courage, not the reckless kind, but the courage to face death calmly, to walk into danger without hesitation, because to hesitate was to dishonor yourself and your clan. Many stories tell of samurai riding alone into enemy lines, arrows thudding into their armor, swords flashing as they cut a path. Even when defeat was certain, they fought on, not because they expected to win, but because Bushido demanded they face death with open eyes. Another pillar was honesty, to speak truth even when it was hard, to act with fairness even when no one was watching. A samurai's word was supposed to be as strong as his sword. If he gave a promise, it was unbreakable. Imagine a world where contracts were not signed with ink but with honor, where a nod of the head and a hand to the sword was enough to seal a pact. This was the weight of honesty. Respect, too, ran deep in the code. Respect for one's enemies, respect for one's teachers, respect for the spirits that guided the world. In battle, a samurai would announce his name before striking, not out of pride, but so his enemy could know who had faced him, so deeds could be remembered. Even in the clash of steel, there was dignity. And above all, there was discipline. Bushido demanded control of body, of mind, of spirit. Imagine a samurai rising before the sun, his breath misting in the cold morning air, practicing cuts again and again until sweat dripped from his brow, his face calm, his focus absolute. This training was not only for war, it was for life. A warrior who could master himself could master the chaos around him. But Bushido also carried a darker weight, because honor was more important than life. A samurai who failed his duty, who betrayed his lord, or who lived in shame had only one path left: seppuku, ritual suicide. Imagine the stillness of the room, tatami mats clean and plain, a small blade set before the warrior, witnesses kneeling in silence, the smell of incense heavy in the air. With steady hands, the warrior takes the blade, and in that final act he restores his honor. It was brutal, but to them it was beautiful, a way to die with dignity rather than live in disgrace. This idea may feel strange to us now, but to the samurai, it was the ultimate expression of Bushido, to live every moment as if death could come at any time, to make choices that honored your name, your family, your lord, and when the end came, to meet it without fear. Bushido was not about survival, it was about meaning. Bushido also connected the sword to the soul. The katana was not just a weapon, it was the living symbol of the code. Sharp, pure, unyielding. When a samurai wore his sword at his side, it was as if Bushido itself walked with him. Children of samurai families were taught to bow to their father's sword, to treat it with reverence, because it was not only steel, it was honor made solid. Over centuries, the code grew deeper. Zen Buddhism shaped it with lessons of calm, meditation, and emptiness. Confucianism added ideas of duty, respect, and hierarchy. Shinto gave it reverence for ancestors and nature. Together they created a moral universe. Bushido was not just about fighting, it was about living with purpose, carrying yourself with dignity, treating others with fairness, and above all, never forgetting that your life belonged to something greater. Stories of Bushido filled the culture. Tales of warriors who chose death rather than betrayal, poems written by men on the eve of battle, words carved into memory like the steel of their swords. One famous poem says, "Though I may die, I shall not forget my honor." Simple, but powerful. These words were whispered by countless warriors as they rode into the storm. Bushido was also tested by history. During the Mongol invasions of the 13th century, samurai faced enemies unlike any before, armies vast and brutal, ships crowding the seas. Yet even when outnumbered, they held their ground, the clash of steel echoing against the roar of waves. They fought not only for victory but for honor. Their code demanded it. And in the end, storms destroyed the Mongol fleets. But it was the spirit of the samurai that stood unbroken. The code also extended into times of peace. When wars faded and the land was calmer, samurai turned Bushido inward, practicing tea ceremonies, poetry, calligraphy, gardens of stone and water. Imagine a warrior kneeling in silence, pouring tea with graceful movements, his sword resting at his side, his heart calm and ready. Bushido was not only about killing, it was about discipline in all things, finding beauty in simplicity, strength and restraint. Yet as centuries passed, Bushido also became a burden. It demanded perfection in a world that was never perfect. Many samurai lived torn between duty and desire, between loyalty and survival. Still, the code endured. shaping their choices, guiding their lives, and leaving behind a legacy that would echo long after the last sword was sheathed. Even today, the idea of Bushido still breathes in Japan, in martial arts, in stories, in the quiet dignity with which people face hardship. It is not just the past, it is a shadow that still walks beside the present.
Imagine standing on a hilltop as the sun rises over medieval Japan, mist curling like smoke through valleys, rivers gleaming like silver blades, and in the distance, a fortress rises against the horizon. Tall wooden towers, stone walls, banners snapping in the wind. Inside the walls, men in armor sharpen their swords, servants carry rice and water, archers stand ready on high platforms, and at the center of it all, a lord sits in quiet command. This is not just a castle, it is a world, a beating heart of power, and across the land there are many like it, each one home to a clan that will fight, scheme, and spill rivers of blood to hold on to its power. This is the age of castles, clans, and endless feuds. By the 13th century, the samurai had risen from hired swords to lords of provinces, and with power came the need for protection. Villages could be burned, fields stolen, but a castle could hold against the storm. At first, these castles were simple, wooden stockades, rough walls built on hills or river bends. But as warfare grew sharper, so did the castles. Stone bases rose higher, moats filled with water, gates fortified with iron. Climbing one of these walls was like trying to climb a mountain under fire. The castle became both sword and shield. Step inside one of these strongholds and the world changes. You would walk across heavy gates, smelling of pine, hear the crunch of gravel underfoot, see courtyards where soldiers trained with spears and bows, women of the household carrying water jars, children practicing with wooden swords, the air thick with smoke from cooking fires, every sound echoing with discipline. The castle was not only defense, it was a city in miniature, a place where daily life and military readiness blended into one. The clans that built these castles were families turned armies. Loyalty ran through blood and oath. Each clan carried a crest, a mon, painted on banners and armor, fluttering like a signature of power. The Takeda with their red banners, the Oda with their bold circle, the Uesugi with their rising sun. These symbols were more than decoration, they were identity. When warriors marched to war, the battlefield became a sea of colors, each banner a declaration of pride and defiance. But with many castles and many clans came endless conflict. Imagine two rival clans staring across a river, their banners swaying in the wind, scouts slipping through forests at night, assassins sneaking into enemy camps, alliances sealed with marriage today, broken by betrayal tomorrow. Japan became a chessboard of shifting loyalties, each lord playing for survival, for honor, and for dominance. These feuds were not small quarrels, they tore the land apart. Provinces burned, peasants fled into forests, rivers filled with corpses after battles. And yet, amid the destruction, the samurai code of honor still demanded respect. Duels were fought beneath banners. Warriors called out their names before charging. Even in chaos, dignity remained. But dignity did not soften the suffering. Families were shattered, lands ruined, and children raised knowing nothing but the drumbeat of war. The Sengoku period, the age of warring states, became the height of this conflict. From the mid-15th century to the late 16th, Japan was engulfed in near-constant civil war. Lords rose and fell with dizzying speed. Castles changed hands again and again, betrayals and victories written in blood. Imagine a world where tomorrow could bring fortune or ruin, where every sunrise carried the smell of smoke and the promise of battle. And yet, even in this storm, brilliance shone. Warlords like Takeda Shingen and Uesugi Kenshin became legends. Their armies clashed in epic battles where thousands of spears glittered under the sun, their strategies studied for centuries after. Oda Nobunaga, ruthless and bold, brought firearms into the battlefield, breaking the old ways of bow and sword. His rise shook Japan to its core. Castles fell before his cannons, clans crumbled under his firepower. Inside the castles, life was a balance of fear and ritual. At dawn, drums echoed across the courtyards. Warriors lined up for inspection. The clang of armor, the gleam of polished swords. Meals of rice and miso shared quickly before drills began. At night, torches lit the gates. The air filled with the hum of insects and the whispers of guards, always watchful, always waiting. Children of lords learned to read poetry and study tactics. Daughters trained with naginata to defend their homes if the men fell. The castle was not only a fortress, it was a school of survival. And still, loyalty was the blood that bound clans together. But loyalty could be as fragile as glass. A single defeat, a whispered promise of land, or a hidden insult could shatter it. Alliances broke overnight. Vassals turned on masters. Brothers fought brothers, and the land groaned under the weight of endless feuds. Honor was everything, but ambition was relentless. The smell of burning villages drifted across valleys. Refugees carried children on their backs. Merchants gambled their lives traveling from one clan's land to another, praying their goods would not be seized at the next border. Temples filled with prayers for peace. Monks chanting while the sound of war drums echoed outside their gates. Japan lived in a rhythm of violence, yet also in a rhythm of resilience. The people endured, planting rice again even in fields stained red. But the castles themselves tell us something deeper. They were not only defenses, they were symbols. When a lord built a new castle, it was a statement. I am here. I am strong. I will endure. Imagine standing before Himeji Castle, its white walls gleaming like wings against the sky. Or Azuchi Castle, built by Nobunaga with unheard-of grandeur. These structures were not just military, they were dreams, carved in stone and wood. They told the land who ruled and who would be remembered. This constant storm of clans and castles shaped the very spirit of the samurai. It hardened them, tested their loyalty, sharpened their swords, and filled their lives with purpose. But it also made them restless, always looking for advantage, always ready for betrayal. Honor guided them, but ambition drove them. And together they created a society where every man was both warrior and pawn. And yet, out of this storm, unity would one day rise. The endless feuds would pave the way for leaders strong enough to bring the clans together, to end the chaos, and to create a Japan no longer torn by constant war. But before that unity, the samurai had to face not only each other, but enemies beyond their shores.
Picture a battlefield, dust rising in clouds, warriors clashing in chaos, swords ringing, arrows flying, men shouting in fury and fear. Now picture one figure in the center of this storm, calm as still water, his breath steady, his eyes clear. While death swirls around him, he moves with a grace that seems almost unreal. Every strike precise, every motion deliberate. This is not just skill, it is spirit. It is Zen, the secret that gave the samurai the power to face chaos with serenity, to wield the sword not only with muscle, but with the mind. This is the union of steel and silence, the Zen spirit and the sword. To understand this connection, we must step away from the battlefield and into the temple. Imagine a Zen garden, raked gravel flowing like waves, rocks standing like islands, the air filled with the scent of pine and incense. Monks move quietly, their robes brushing against wooden floors polished by centuries. A bell tolls softly, echoing into the stillness. Here the samurai came not to fight, but to learn, to sit cross-legged, to breathe, to face themselves. Zen Buddhism had come to Japan from China, and its teachings struck a deep chord with the warrior class. It spoke of simplicity, of discipline, of living in the present moment, and above all, of facing death without fear. For a samurai, this was not philosophy, it was survival. On the battlefield, hesitation meant death, and Zen taught them to let go of fear, to see life and death as part of the same path. Imagine a samurai at dawn, kneeling in meditation, his sword resting beside him, the air cold, the birds just beginning to stir. He closes his eyes, his breath steady, his mind clears. When he rises, every movement is focused. When he takes his sword in hand, it feels like an extension of his spirit. The strike is no longer frantic or fearful. It is calm, inevitable. This was the gift of Zen. It gave the samurai control, not only of the sword, but of themselves. In a world of endless wars and feuds, inner calm was as valuable as armor. The sword was sharpened by steel, but the warrior was sharpened by silence. The practice of Zen also shaped the art of the sword itself. Kenjutsu, the art of combat, became more than a technique, it became a meditation. Imagine two swordsmen facing each other in a dojo, the air tense, wooden floors creaking beneath their bare feet. For long moments, neither moves, both waiting, both breathing. Then, in an instant, the clash comes, fast, sharp, like lightning splitting the sky. And just as quickly, it ends, one strike deciding everything. This was not endless swinging, it was patience, clarity, and timing, all lessons of Zen. But Zen was not only about combat. It seeped into every corner of samurai life, into tea ceremonies, where pouring water became as precise as drawing a blade, into calligraphy, where each brushstroke carried the weight of focus, into gardens, where stones and streams became mirrors of the soul.
To live with discipline in peace was to be ready for discipline in war. The two were never separate. This blending of spirit and steel created a new kind of warrior, not just a killer, but a seeker of harmony, a man who could cut down an enemy in the morning and write a poem about the moon in the evening. Imagine a samurai sitting by lantern light, writing with careful strokes, the smell of ink filling the room. Outside, his sword rests on a stand, silent, yet always near. The sword and the brush, the strike and the silence, joined by the same spirit. Zen also taught impermanence, the idea that everything is fleeting. Blossoms fall, seasons change, life ends. This gave the samurai a strange kind of freedom. If death could come at any time, then each moment had to be lived with intensity, with clarity. The sword strike had to be final. The word had to be true. The life had to be honorable. And in battle, this philosophy showed itself. Chronicles tell of warriors who fought with no trace of fear, who accepted death as easily as sleep. This was not recklessness, it was resolve. Imagine the calm in a man's eyes as he charges into a storm of arrows, not hoping to live, not eager to die, but simply present, his focus absolute. The relationship between Zen and the sword also gave rise to rituals that define the samurai spirit. Sword drawing itself became an art, iaijutsu, the ability to draw and strike in a single perfect motion. It demanded not just speed, but awareness, the body moving without thought, the mind empty of hesitation. Like the raked lines of a Zen garden, simple, clean, powerful. This unity shaped how the samurai were remembered, not as men lost in endless bloodshed, but as figures of discipline and balance. Even their poetry reflected this. Many left death verses, short verses written before their final battle or before seppuku. Lines that captured both acceptance and serenity. One wrote, "Like dew on the grass, I vanish." Another, "Cutting through the sky, the wild geese leave no trace." These were not words of despair, but of peace. The sword itself became a symbol of this harmony, curved, elegant, yet deadly. It was both weapon and teacher. The forging of a blade was seen almost as a spiritual act. Smiths folded steel again and again, removing weakness, creating strength, much like the way meditation stripped away distraction to reveal clarity. The finished sword was not just steel, it was spirit. And in this spirit, the samurai found meaning. Their lives were short, their battles constant, but within Zen they found a way to face it all without breaking, to carry stillness inside chaos, to find beauty in the fleeting, and to make even death an act of dignity. Yet this union of sword and spirit was not only for the samurai themselves, it shaped all of Japan. Zen temples flourished under their patronage, gardens, paintings, and rituals spread across the land. The influence of the warrior class reached beyond war into culture, art, and philosophy. The sword was no longer just a weapon, it was a mirror reflecting the very soul of a nation. But the world was not done testing the samurai. For all their discipline and spirit, storms still gathered, great wars still loomed, and foreign threats would one day crash against their shores. The Zen spirit gave them strength, But strength would soon be tested not only in the heart, but in the clash of nations.
Imagine a land once torn apart by endless wars, castles burned, clans shattered, rivers running red. Now picture that same land under one rule. Banners of rival lords lowered, swords sheathed, and peace stretching across the horizon like the calm after a storm. In this moment, Japan enters its golden age, not ruled by the distant emperor of poetry and silk, but by the shogun, the supreme military ruler, his word law, his reach absolute. This is the age when the samurai rose higher than ever before, not just as warriors, but as the very backbone of society. This is the golden age of the shogun. The story begins after centuries of chaos. The Sengoku period had left Japan scarred. Rival clans clashed without end, villages burned, peasants fled. War was life. But out of the storm emerged three great unifiers: Oda Nobunaga, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and Tokugawa Ieyasu. Each carried a vision of a Japan no longer broken. Nobunaga brought firepower, breaking the old ways with guns and cannon. Hideyoshi brought cunning, weaving alliances and crushing resistance. And Ieyasu, patient as stone, brought endurance. When the dust settled, it was Ieyasu who stood victorious. His family would rule for over 250 years. Under the Tokugawa shogunate, Japan finally knew stability. Imagine walking into Edo, the shogun's capital, the city buzzing with life, wooden bridges arching over rivers, streets filled with merchants calling out their wares, the smell of grilled fish and rice drifting from food stalls, samurai walking with swords at their sides, peasants bowing as they passed, everything ordered, everything in its place. The chaos of the past had given way to a strict and lasting peace. The shogun ruled not from poetry, but from power. His castle in Edo rose like a mountain of wood and stone, gates heavy with iron, walls stretching wide. Within its halls, decisions were made that touched every province, every village, every farm. Daimyo, the great lords, were required to swear loyalty, and to ensure obedience, they had to leave their families in Edo as hostages. It was a system of control as clever as it was ruthless. Rebellion became nearly impossible. The land grew calm. For the samurai, this age was both triumph and challenge. They were no longer just warriors called to battle. They became the ruling class, guardians of law, administrators of land, teachers of discipline. Imagine a samurai in this new world, walking the streets of Edo, his armor left at home, but his sword still at his side. Children bowing as he passed, merchants lowering their eyes. He was a figure of respect. Yet without constant war, many samurai faced an emptiness, their swords sharp but unused, their spirit restless in a time of peace. To fill this void, culture flourished. The samurai turned their discipline toward art. They practiced calligraphy with the same focus they once gave the blade. They built tea houses where ceremonies unfolded with precise grace, every gesture a lesson in harmony. They supported the growth of kabuki theater, where bright costumes and painted faces brought stories to life. And they wrote poetry, short verses that captured fleeting moments, a blossom falling, a bird in flight, all through the eyes of warriors who now looked inward as much as outward. But peace did not mean weakness. The shogun kept the samurai ready. Drills continued in castle courtyards, swords polished until they gleamed like mirrors. Archers still practiced on ranges, muskets still fired in clouds of smoke, the smell of powder hanging in the air. The warrior class remained sharp, but their battles were now less on fields of blood and more in the arenas of honor, loyalty, and ritual. economy also thrived under the shogunate. Roads were built connecting distant provinces, merchants carried goods from silk to salt, rice became the measure of wealth, and towns grew into cities. Imagine travelers on the Tokaido Road, the main artery of Japan. Inns filled with laughter, sake poured into cups, lanterns glowing in the night. The land no longer crippled by constant raids. Prosperity was possible. Yet within this golden age lay contradictions. The strict social order placed everyone in ranks, samurai at the top, followed by peasants, artisans, and merchants. But as peace stretched on, merchants grew rich, while many samurai fell into debt. Unable to farm or trade, they relied on stipends that often were not enough. The proud warrior class sometimes lived poorer than the merchants they looked down upon. This tension whispered beneath the surface, cracks in the perfection of the shogunate. Still, the cultural flowering of this age remains unmatched. Castles like Himeji gleamed white against the sky, towering over the land like symbols of eternal strength. Ukiyo-e woodblock prints spread images of landscapes, courtesans, and warriors to the masses. Haiku poetry captured the heart of fleeting beauty. The Golden Age was not only about politics, it was about the shaping of Japanese identity itself. The shogunate also sought to protect Japan from outside influence. Foreign traders were tightly controlled, Christianity was banned, and for more than 2 centuries, Japan lived in near isolation. The world outside moved fast, but inside, time seemed to slow. Traditions deepened, rituals refined. The samurai stood as guardians of a Japan untouched by foreign storms. Imagine the serenity of this age, walking through a Zen garden in Kyoto, the raked gravel smooth as waves, the air quiet, a samurai kneeling in meditation while his swords rested aside. Outside the castle town bustles with energy, merchants bargaining, children running, peasants unloading rice carts. But above it all, the presence of the shogun is felt, an invisible hand keeping order, keeping peace. But peace, like all things, cannot last forever. The Golden Age was real, yet it carried the seeds of its own end. The samurai grew restless, merchants grew bold. Foreign ships would one day appear on the horizon, black hulls and smoke announcing that the world could not be held at bay forever. The shogunate's grip, though strong, would one day falter. For now, though, the vision of this golden age remains. The streets of Edo alive with color, castles strong and unbroken, samurai standing tall in silks and steel, a society balanced between power and beauty, discipline and art, war and peace. This was the height of the samurai world, when their place was unshakable, their honor unmatched, and their presence eternal.
Imagine the roar of war drums echoing across the land, the smell of burning wood thick in the air, banners snapping in the wind as thousands of warriors gather beneath the rising sun. The ground shakes beneath the thunder of hooves, arrows darken the sky, and at the heart of this storm stand the samurai. Their armor gleaming, their swords flashing, their voices shouting oaths of loyalty. This is no longer the quiet duel of 2 warriors on a lonely field. This is the battlefield of nations, where entire armies clash, where the fate of Japan itself trembles with every strike of steel. By the time of the Great Wars, the samurai had transformed. No longer just mounted archers or small bands of retainers, they were the backbone of organized armies, each clan fielding thousands of men, every soldier drilled, every banner carrying the weight of generations.
Imagine standing at the edge of one of these battlefields, the air vibrating with the sound of horns and conch shells, smoke curling from torches, the tension so thick it feels like the earth itself is holding its breath. Then the order comes, and chaos explodes. The Mongol invasions of the 13th century tested this warrior class like never before. Fleets of ships appeared on the horizon, dark silhouettes against the waves, carrying tens of thousands of soldiers armed with weapons the Japanese had never seen. Thunderous bombs that burst with fire and smoke, shields locked in walls, arrows released in endless storms. The samurai, used to ritual duels and announced challenges, suddenly faced a storm of mass warfare, brutal, impersonal, and unrelenting. Picture the clash. Samurai charging into the surf to meet the invaders, their horses thrashing against the waves, the salt spray stinging their eyes, arrows rattling against their armor. Yet still they pressed on, swords flashing, cries of, "For my lord!" carried over the roar of the sea. The Mongols fought in tight formations, drums beating time, voices shouting in unison, while the samurai fought as individuals, each seeking glory. Yet together they held the line, night after night, wave after wave. And then nature itself struck. Typhoons roared out of the sea, winds tearing ships apart, waves swallowing armies whole. The invaders broken not only by steel, but by storm. The Japanese called it kamikaze, the divine wind, and it became legend, proof that the samurai spirit was guarded by the gods. The battlefield of nations had turned into a crucible of faith and fire, and from it the samurai emerged unshaken. But the wars did not end with foreign threats. The greatest battlefields of the samurai were against each other. Clan against clan, daimyo against daimyo. The Sengoku period became an age where entire provinces rose and fell in blood. Armies numbering in the tens of thousands marched across valleys and plains, banners fluttering like forests in the wind, castles besieged for months, the smell of smoke choking the air as villages were reduced to ash. For the peasants, it was terror. For the samurai, it was destiny. These battles were not blind chaos. They were theaters of strategy. Imagine Takeda Shinjin's cavalry charging in disciplined lines, the ground shaking like thunder. Or Uesugi Kenshin's forces cutting across rivers with perfect timing, their armor shining in the morning light. And above all, imagine Oda Nobunaga, ruthless and brilliant, who brought firearms into the battlefield. Rows of musketeers firing in volleys, smoke billowing, the sharp crack of gunfire echoing across valleys. Swords met steel, but also gunpowder. The age of the battlefield was changing. Step inside the mind of a samurai during one of these wars. He wakes before dawn, the camp still dark, the air filled with the smell of horses and smoke. His armor cold as he straps it on, his sword polished until it glows in the torchlight. Around him, men whisper prayers, some write poems to leave behind, others laugh loudly to hide their fear. When the drums sound, his heart pounds, but his face is calm. He knows Bushido demands courage even when death is certain. The battlefield itself was a world of senses, the metallic clang of steel, the cries of men, the smell of blood and dust mixing with sweat, the ground shaking beneath running feet, banners falling, horns blaring, the chaos swallowing everything. Yet within this storm, the samurai sought stillness.
the Zen spirit guiding their strikes, every movement deliberate, every cut final. Amid fire and death, they carried serenity like a hidden flame. These wars reshaped Japan. Castles rose and fell. Alliances shifted like shadows, and from the battlefield came the leaders who would unite the nation. Toyotomi Hideyoshi, once a peasant who climbed through loyalty and brilliance to command entire armies. His vision extended even beyond Japan. He dreamed of conquering Korea and even China, sending fleets of samurai across the seas. For the first time, the warrior class marched not only to defend, but to expand, stepping onto foreign soil. Imagine the samurai landing on Korean shores, the surf crashing, their armor heavy with salt, their swords gleaming, their banners stiff in the sea wind. They fought fierce battles in strange lands, facing warriors who fought with new tactics, using terrain, cannons, and walls unlike anything in Japan. It was the battlefield of nations in its truest form. Japan clashing with the world, the samurai discovering both triumph and limits. Yet even as they fought abroad, the greatest battlefields still lay at home. The struggle for unification reached its peak at Sekigahara in 1600, the largest battle in samurai history. Over 150,000 men clashing in a single day. Imagine the field covered with fog at dawn, banners rising like forests of color, the thunder of muskets, the crash of cavalry, betrayals unfolding in the chaos, sides switching mid-battle. By sunset, the ground was littered with the fallen, and Tokugawa Ieyasu stood victorious. The battlefield had decided the future of Japan. The shogunate was born. This era of great battles carved the samurai into legend. They were no longer just fighters. They were symbols of loyalty, courage, and discipline. Their duels remembered, their poems preserved, their honor etched into the memory of the nation. They stood not only on the battlefields of Japan, but on the stage of history itself. Warriors whose way of life would echo for centuries. But victory carried a strange fate, for as Japan entered peace under the Tokugawa shogunate, the battlefield grew silent. The swords that had sung for centuries now rested in their scabbards. The warrior class, forged in war, had to find new meaning in peace. Some turned to art, some to philosophy, some struggled with idleness. The battlefield of nations faded, replaced by the stillness of an ordered society.
Imagine standing on the shores of Japan, the sea stretching endlessly before you, the air heavy with salt, gulls crying overhead. And then, on the horizon, black dots appear, growing larger, darker, until the horizon is filled with ships, hundreds of them, their sails billowing like storm clouds, their decks crammed with warriors from another world, drums beating like thunder across the water. The greatest empire the earth had ever seen had come to conquer. The Mongols, unstoppable across Asia, now set their eyes on Japan. But waiting for them, on those rocky shores, stood the samurai, swords polished, armor gleaming, hearts steady, ready to face the storm. This was steel against the Mongol storm, a clash that would shape history. For centuries, the Mongol Empire had swept across the earth like wildfire, from the frozen steppes of Mongolia to the sands of Persia, from the plains of Russia to the walls of China. They crushed armies with speed and discipline no one had seen before.
Under Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis, their empire reached the seas, and Japan, a cluster of islands on the edge of their vast domain, looked like the next jewel to seize. Kublai sent messages to the Japanese court, demanding submission, demanding tribute, but the shogunate refused. The answer was silence, and so the Mongols prepared to bring their fury. In 1274, the first invasion fleet set sail, hundreds of ships carrying tens of thousands of soldiers, Mongols, Chinese, Koreans, all under one command. Imagine the sight from the Japanese coast. Fishermen staring in horror as the sea itself seemed to turn black with sails, the thunder of foreign drums rolling across the waves. This was unlike anything Japan had ever faced. The samurai were used to battles of honor, duels between warriors who announced their names before charging, but now they faced a war machine built for annihilation. The Mongols landed on the island of Tsushima, and what followed was slaughter. The samurai defenders, few in number, charged bravely, their arrows and swords flashing, but the Mongols fought differently. They advanced in tight formations, shields overlapping, spears thrusting in rhythm. And from behind came the thunderclap of explosives, iron bombs that burst in fire and smoke, shaking the ground and terrifying horses. The smell of burning powder filled the air. The sound deafened men who had never heard such weapons. The defenders fought with valor, but were overwhelmed. Villages burned, survivors cut down. Tsushima fell in a day. From there, the Mongol fleet swept to Iki Island and Hakata Bay on Kyushu, where thousands of samurai gathered to resist. Imagine the shoreline bristling with warriors, banners flying, the crash of waves against rocks. The Mongols surged ashore, arrows raining, drums pounding. But here, the samurai struck with ferocity, charging in waves, dueling enemy captains, cutting through lines with curved blades. They were outnumbered, outgunned, but their spirit held. The battle raged through the day, blood soaking the sand, screams rising with the smoke of burning villages. As night fell, the Mongols retreated to their ships, planning to return at dawn to finish the fight. But the sea had other plans. A sudden storm swept in, winds howling, waves rising like mountains, wooden ships splintering, men screaming as the sea swallowed them whole. The survivors limped back across the waves, the invasion broken, the samurai battered but unbowed. The people of Japan believed they had been saved by the gods, and they gave the storm a name, Kamikaze, the divine wind. But Kublai Khan was not finished. Humiliation was not in his nature. In 1281, he launched an even greater invasion, a fleet so massive it dwarfed the first. Some say over 4,000 ships carrying 140,000 soldiers, the largest naval armada the world had ever seen. Imagine the horizon once again, but this time the sea is not dotted, it is consumed. Wave after wave of ships stretching farther than the eye can see, sails blotting out the sky. The Mongol storm had returned. The Japanese shogunate had prepared. Walls of stone had been built along Hakata Bay, stretching for miles, bristling with defenses. Samurai stood shoulder to shoulder behind them, bows drawn, swords ready. The Mongols crashed ashore again, their formations tight, their weapons deadly, their bombs bursting with fire and smoke, but this time the defenders were ready. Arrows poured down, swords flashed in the chaos of the shoreline. The samurai fought not as scattered duelists, but as one. adapting to the brutal rhythm of Mongol war. Imagine the clash on the beaches, the screams of horses as bombs burst, the air thick with smoke and salt. Night, the Japanese launched daring raids. Samurai boarding ships under the cover of darkness, cutting down sleeping soldiers, setting fire to enemy decks. The sea lit with flames, the smell of charred wood and flesh carried on the wind. The Mongols began to falter. Weeks dragged into months, supplies dwindled, disease spread through the crowded ships, frustration grew. And then, once again, the sea rose. A typhoon, greater than the first, roared out of the Pacific. Winds howling like demons, rain lashing like whips, waves towering like mountains. The Mongol fleet scattered, ships smashed against each other, masts torn away, hulls split open. Thousands drowned, their cries lost in the storm. The survivors crawled onto shore only to be cut down by waiting samurai. The greatest invasion force in history had been annihilated, not just by men, but by wind and wave. The legend of the kamikaze was sealed. To the Japanese, it was proof that heaven itself protected them. The samurai had fought with unmatched courage, their steel holding the line against the greatest empire the world had ever seen, and nature had delivered the final blow. The Mongols never returned. Their empire continued elsewhere, but the islands of Japan remained untouched, defended by warriors whose spirit could not be broken. But the aftermath was not simple. The victory had saved Japan, yet it also brought hardship. The samurai had fought bravely, but there was little reward. No conquered lands to divide, no riches to claim, only debt from building defenses and hardship from lost harvests. Many samurai fell into poverty, their swords still sharp, but their bellies empty. The storm had saved Japan, but it had also shaken the foundations of the warrior class. Still, the story of steel against the Mongol storm lived on, told in temples, carved into chronicles, painted on screens, a reminder of the courage of the samurai and the favor of the gods. The image of ships shattered by wind, of warriors standing unyielding on the shore, became part of Japan's very identity, a tale of defiance, survival, and destiny.
Picture the setting sun casting long shadows over a silent castle, the once busy courtyards now quiet, banners that once snapped in the wind now hang faded and still. A lone samurai walks through the stone gates, his swords at his side, his head held high, but his eyes heavy, for he knows the truth that few dare to speak. The age of endless battle is over. The age of the shogun's glory is fading, and the world he was born to serve is slipping away. This is not the dawn of power. This is the twilight, the slow, beautiful, tragic fading of the samurai. For centuries, the samurai had ruled Japan, their swords sharp, their discipline unmatched, their loyalty unshaken. They had defended their islands against invaders, crushed rebellions, and served the shogun with absolute faith. But after the Mongol storm, after centuries of struggle, peace took hold. Under the Tokugawa shogunate, the land was stable, the roads safe, the villages quiet. And for a warrior class bred for battle, peace became both a blessing and a curse. Imagine being a samurai in the 17th century, walking through the bustling streets of Edo, the capital glowing with lantern light, merchants calling out from shops, the smell of grilled fish and sweet rice cakes drifting in the air, peasants laughing, children playing. Yet you, with your swords at your waist, feel out of place.
because the world no longer needs you to fight. You are respected, yes, bowed to, yes, but your blade, once the key to survival, now sits untouched in its scabbard. Many samurai turned their skills toward administration, serving as officials, teachers, and bureaucrats. They studied Confucian texts, wrote poetry, and practiced calligraphy. Their discipline redirected into the arts of peace. Others turned to rituals of Bushido, perfecting the way of the warrior in philosophy rather than practice. Yet beneath the surface, many struggled. Stipends from their lords were often too small, debts mounted, and proud warriors found themselves poorer than the merchants they scorned. Picture the contradictions of this twilight age. A samurai kneeling in meditation at dawn, his sword polished to a mirror's shine, his heart trained to face death without fear. Then later that day, walking through a market, begging a moneylender for coin, his honor intact, but his stomach empty. The world that once placed the warrior at its center now placed him on the margins, still honored in name, but fading in reality. Yet the spirit of the samurai still burned. Stories tell of men who clung fiercely to their code even as the world shifted, none more famous than the tale of the 47 Ronin. Imagine it, 47 masterless samurai, their lord disgraced and forced to die by seppuku, their lives stripped of purpose, yet their loyalty unbroken. For 2 years they plodded in silence, their swords hidden, their grief buried, until at last they struck, avenging their master with deadly precision, then surrendering themselves to the law, knowing they would be executed. Their story became legend, proof that even in decline, the fire of Bushido could not be extinguished. But time is relentless, and the world outside Japan began to change. Beyond the seas, empires were rising. Ships armed with cannons and rifles prowled the oceans, their black smoke staining the skies, while Japan remained closed, isolated under the Tokugawa rule. The samurai sharpened swords, while the rest of the world forged guns, and the gap grew wider with every passing decade. By the mid-19th century, the twilight deepened. Foreign ships appeared on Japan's shores, their cannons pointed toward the land, their demands clear: open your ports, trade with us, or face destruction. Imagine the fear in Edo Bay in 1853 when Commodore Perry's black ship sailed in, steam engines churning, smoke rising like storm clouds. The samurai who rushed to the shore had their swords ready, but in their hearts they knew a blade could not cut through iron hulls. Honor could not stop cannon fire. The shogunate, once unshakable, now wavered. Samurai themselves split into factions, some demanding resistance, others calling for reform. The land trembled with unrest, and once again the warrior class found itself at the center of history. But this time, the enemy was not only foreign, it was change itself. Civil war erupted, the Boshin War. Samurai on both sides clashing for the future of Japan. Imagine the chaos. Battlefields filled with both swords and rifles, men in armor charging against lines of muskets, cannon fire shaking the ground, smoke choking the air, the clang of steel drowned out by the crack of gunfire. It was the end of an era, the old ways meeting the new in fire and blood. When the dust settled, the shogunate was gone, the emperor restored, and Japan turned toward modernity. The samurai, once the highest class, were stripped of their privileges, their stipends gone, their right to carry swords abolished. Imagine the pain of a man who had lived his entire life defined by his blade, being told he could no longer wear it. A piece of his soul torn away. The twilight had become night. Some adapted, becoming officers in the new army, scholars or politicians, carrying their discipline into the new age, but others could not. Uprisings flared, most famously the Satsuma Rebellion led by Saigo Takamori, a man called the last true samurai. Imagine his final stand at Shidoyama in 1877, surrounded by modern soldiers with rifles and cannon, his warriors charging one last time with swords flashing, bullets tearing through the air, until at last he fell. His rebellion crushed, but his spirit immortal. The twilight of the samurai was tragic, but it was not only loss, for their legacy endured. Their code of Bushido, their discipline, their sense of honor. These ideals sank deep into the soul of Japan, shaping not only warriors, but generations to come. In the classrooms, in the businesses, in the arts, echoes of the samurai way still linger. Their twilight did not end in darkness, but in transformation. Imagine the image we are left with, a lone figure silhouetted against the setting sun, sword at his side, his world fading, but his spirit eternal. The samurai may have lost their place in power, but they did not lose their place in history. Their twilight was not an end, but a bridge, carrying their honor into the modern world.
Imagine a great castle at the heart of Edo, its walls towering, its gates ironclad, its halls echoing with the voices of samurai who once ruled Japan with unshakable power. Now picture those same halls silent, scrolls stacked in dusty corners, armor polished but never worn, swords resting in scabbards like relics of another age. Outside the gates, the world has changed. Black ships belch smoke on the horizon, cannons glint in the sunlight, merchants grow richer than warriors, and peasants whisper of revolution. The age of the shogunate, once mighty as a mountain, is beginning to crack. This is the story of its fall. For over 250 years, the Tokugawa shogunate had ruled Japan, its order strict, its peace unmatched. Samurai stood as the ruling class, farmers tilled the land, merchants sold their goods, and the emperor remained a distant figurehead. The system seemed eternal, unshakable. Yet beneath the surface, change was coming, like water dripping on stone, slow but unstoppable. The seeds of decline were sown in the very peace the shogunate had created. With no wars to fight, many samurai became administrators, scholars, or simply idle. Their stipends fixed and often too small. Debts mounted, honor weighed heavy against empty purses. Imagine a proud warrior, his swords gleaming at his side, bowing in the streets, yet inside worrying about how to feed his children. Across Japan, this became a common story, the warrior class hollowed out by peace. Meanwhile, merchants, once placed at the bottom of society, grew wealthy, their shops filled with silk, rice, and exotic goods, their coffers deeper than many lords. The balance of power tilted quietly, the merchant's gold buying influence where once only steel had ruled. Resentment brewed, the strict social order of the shogunate beginning to feel less like stability and more like a chain. And then, in 1853, the storm arrived. Commodore Matthew Perry sailed into Edo Bay with his black ships, steam-driven vessels belching smoke, their cannons aimed at the shore.
Imagine the fear as people crowded the coast to see these monsters of iron and fire. Samurai rushing to the bay with swords ready, only to realize their blades could do nothing against cannon fire. The shogunate faced the choice: open Japan to the world or risk destruction. Reluctantly, the shogun signed treaties. Ports opened, trade began. But with trade came humiliation. Unequal treaties gave foreign powers the advantage. Many Japanese saw it as weakness, a betrayal of sovereignty. Anger burned in the hearts of samurai who believed the shogunate had failed to protect the nation. Cries of Sano joy, revere the emperor, expel the barbarians, echoed in streets and temples. The emperor, long kept in shadow, suddenly became a symbol of resistance. Young samurai and scholars rallied to his name, seeing him as the rightful leader of Japan, a banner of unity against the failing shogunate. The nation split, some calling for reform, others for rebellion. The once solid foundation of Tokugawa rule shaking with every passing year. The Boshin War erupted in 1868, a civil war that would decide the fate of Japan. Imagine the clash of old and new, samurai in armor charging with swords drawn, facing soldiers armed with rifles and cannon. The crack of gunfire splitting the air, the smell of powder choking the battlefield, ancient cries of loyalty drowned by modern warfare, the old ways and the new colliding in fire and blood. At Toba Fushimi, one of the first great battles, Tokugawa forces marched proudly, banners high, but were met with rifle fire and cannon blasts. Their lines shattered, their warriors cut down. The shock was immense. Honor and courage could not stand against gunpowder and steel. The Tokugawa army faltered, their spirit breaking. Edo itself, the heart of the shogunate, faced inevitable defeat. But here history took a quieter turn. Saigo Takamori, a leader of the imperial forces, and Katsu Kaishu, a Tokugawa commander, negotiated peace. The city surrendered without destruction. Imagine it. A great castle that had once symbolized absolute power, now handed over without a single sword drawn. The fall, not in flames, but in silence. For the samurai loyal to the shogunate, it was a bitter end. Men who had given their lives to service now found themselves stripped of power, their stipends gone, their right to carry swords abolished, their status dissolved. Imagine a heartbreak of a warrior who had lived by Bushido, now told that he was no different than a farmer or merchant. Their world ended not with glory, but with loss. Yet even in defeat, the spirit of resistance lived on. Some samurai could not accept the new order. They rose in rebellion. The most famous led by Saigo Takamori himself, once a hero of the Restoration, now its enemy. His Satsuma Rebellion in 1877 saw thousands of samurai making a final charge against the modern army. Rifles firing, cannons booming, their swords flashing in a last desperate stand. When it ended, Saigo lay dead, called forever after the last true samurai. his fall marking the end of an age. The collapse of the shogunate was not only political, it was cultural. Centuries of tradition unraveled, yet at the same time a new Japan was born. Railways stretched across the land, factories rose, soldiers drilled in modern uniforms. The emperor stood not as a symbol in shadow, but as the living ruler of a rising nation. The sacrifice of the samurai cleared the way for the birth of modern Japan. But their story did not vanish. Their code of honor, their discipline, their loyalty, all were remembered, retold in books, plays, and legends. The twilight of the shogunate became not just a tale of loss, but of transformation. The samurai spirit carried forward into a new age, their fall both an end and a beginning.
Imagine standing in modern Japan, neon lights glowing, bullet trains rushing past, skyscrapers rising into the night sky. And yet, in the quiet corners, you still find echoes of another age. A sword displayed in a glass case, a Zen garden raked into perfect lines, a haiku whispered in the breeze of spring blossoms. The samurai are gone, but their spirit is not. Their legacy lingers like an unbroken shadow across centuries, shaping how Japan remembers itself and how the world remembers them. This is the legacy of the last warriors.